I'm Grady Culhane in the CapeCod.com News Center, joined today by a special guest from the Hollywood sphere of Cape Cod. Do you mind just introducing yourself for our listeners?
Or reintroducing myself. I'm Casey Sherman, and I'm back here to share some more stories with you, Grady.
Yeah, it's awesome. Obviously, you're a returning face. There's been a lot of stuff going on, from things involving possible productions in Provincetown with one of your projects to delving into live theater. There's a lot of stuff I wanted to chat with you about today. But first and foremost, you've recently been featured in a lovely article, and I just kind of wanted to touch on that before we got any deeper. Do you mind just you brought in the prop for us on video today, but what's been going on?
Yeah, so I've got a new article out. It's a true crime expose in Boston Magazine, telling the story about a man that's been spending 43 years in a Massachusetts prison for a gangland murder that he did not commit. His name is Jimmy Rodwell. He's 68 years old right now, and he was convicted in 1980 in a brutal murder in Somerville, Massachusetts. Basically, it was a drug deal gone bad, and he was picked out of the blue. It became a cold case for a couple of years before state police and a couple of other entities, focused on this guy out of nowhere, arrested him. And he always thought it was a case of mistaken identity, that any day somebody would understand that mistake and let him go. But they put him in jail. They kept him in jail. Then they put him on trial, and he was convicted. And the really shocking thing here, too, is he was convicted really solely based on the testimony of two people, and they're what we call serial snitches in law enforcement. So basically, prisoners who are looking to shave time off of their own sentences would go testify at any trial that law enforcement wanted them to and say anything that law enforcement wanted them to say. And that, was the case with Jimmy Rodwell. And over the past, 43 years, so many prominent attorneys have raised the real issues of his innocence toward the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But that case has always been deflected. Nobody's already, given the effort to really look at it, because then it becomes, okay, you've got these legislators, these law enforcement detectives, or even judges who have all made their careers based on the conviction of Jimmy Rodwell and others. So they're protecting their own reputations after a while. I mean, we're seeing this unfold right now with the Karen Reed case. And as I mentioned, to people when I talk about this case, if you're really upset about the Karen Reed case, take a look at what they've been doing to Jimmy Rodwell for 43 years now.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is, of course, something that we've, I watch crime shows and stuff like that immediately. Like DNA comes to mind, but this was just before the advent of any of that. Really.
Just before the advent of DNA, which is unfortunate because this was a very close contact murder. So the likelihood that the victim in this case might have gleaned some DNA from his attacker is probably pretty high. Mm-hmm. But again, back in the 1970s, the murder happened in 1978, and I'll just give you a snapshot of what law enforcement protocol was at that time. The victim was killed in his car, and when law enforcement got to the scene, they actually towed the vehicle away from the crime scene with the victim's body still in it. It sounds ludicrous and absolutely silly, but that's what they did back then.
Yeah. So how did you get in touch? How did you learn about this case? What was the spark for you that made you feel like you had to chase this down? What was it for you?
Well, as you know, I get a lot of calls and emails and texts from people that all want me to take a look at, a crime that was committed, whether it's to bring closure and justice for a victim's family, or whether it's to focus on somebody who may or may not have been wrongfully convicted. I always pay attention to all these inquiries, but, they have to reach that level of for me to get involved. So I spent some time with Jimmy Rodwell at Concord State Prison a year ago. And Concord State Prison at the time was the oldest prison in Massachusetts. It's actually been shuttered. So Jimmy Rodwell remains behind bars, yet the prison that he's been in for well over 3 decades is now closed. So they've had to move Jimmy to a facility in Gardner, Massachusetts now. But I stared into Jimmy's eyes and I realized that this guy was telling the truth. And that truth was backed up by thousands of documents that I've poured over reviewed with the assistance of Jimmy's attorneys. Marty Weinberg, who's a very successful and prominent defense attorney in Boston, is just amazing, and he's got some other attorneys as well that have been incredibly helpful. To his plea for innocence, but they're always shouting at the wind and beating their heads against the wall. It might take somebody like me with the pedigree of several New York Times best-selling books and a lot of focus on the work that I do to get more interest in his case.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for him at this point? Have you been in touch recently? Do you think the next steps for him are? And essentially, what are you kind of hoping to get out of this in terms of results?
Well, the result, I want him to walk out of jail sooner rather than later. His attorney, Veronica White, who's really the day-to-day attorney on this case, and Jimmy calls her, the pit bull in a skirt, meaning she has dogged this case for so long, and she's right at the 11th hour. Jimmy is, as I said, he's 68 years old. He's got one more bid for a new trial until those bids are, null and void. We're working to get him a new trial, the 8th trial for him, but also we're working on clemency finally from the state of Massachusetts, because now somebody who's been convicted of a crime can get clemency without accepting responsibility for that crime. Jimmy probably could have walked out of jail several times over the past 43 years had he accepted responsibility for that, but he wouldn't because he's innocent.
An interesting dilemma from the internal moral point of view as well.
I don't know if I could have done that, seeing what life is like for him every single day and knowing that, well, if I said this, even though it was untrue, at least I'd be able to spend a few years with my family, free from the shackles of the prison system. But, Jimmy has a very strong moral compass, and he's willing to stick it out until he has freedom on his terms, not on the terms of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we will stay tuned. It's certainly an interesting story. And regardless of what the resolution is, we'll be happy to have you back in when we get a bit closer as well.
Yeah, and people can, get Boston Magazine. It's the September issue, or they can go on to bostonmagazine.com today and read the article for free and get involved with this case. That's, the groundswell of support. I'm doing interviews like this just to build up a community that is outraged as the community that is defending Karen Read right now.
Do you think it might lead to some kind of cascade effect if this does actually go through? Some other people you think out there that would be maybe thrown into a whirlwind of whether or not they really did it?
Sure. I mean, there are thousands of prisoners across the United States who are serving time for crimes they didn't commit. I'm one person and I can't do it myself, but you've got the Innocence Projects and all these other organizations that look at judicial corruption, law enforcement corruption. And I think that prior to the Karen Read case, people were always saying, well, we do believe law enforcement. And don't get me wrong, I've got, great friends in law enforcement, but there are dirty, rotten apples in every barrel, primarily in law enforcement. And it's about exposing them and getting to the truth.
All right. So as well, you have a lot of productions that are going to the live theater sphere. You did Whitey Bulger earlier with your investigation into that. And now I know there's another one coming up in the spring. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about ongoing productions that you have, some of your involvement, and kind of like what the appeal is for you. And I know there's probably going to be more after that as well. So yeah, can you just tell us a little bit more about some of the live theater components?
Sure. Well, for me, there's nothing like sharing my true crime investigations in front of a live audience. I've done several theatrical productions at the Wilbur Theater in Boston. I'll be taking A Nightmare with Casey Sherman to the Wilbur Theater on March 26th, 2025. In 2023, I cast one of my dear friends and a fellow Barnstable High School alum, Neil McDonough, as Whitey Bulger, and it was an incredible experience to really show the Whitey Bulger story on stage in front of a sold-out room at the Wilbur, one of the most historic theaters in Boston. And I love that format where I'm bringing these stories that I've written, these stories that I've investigated, but I'm also sharing these stories with actors on stage. So, I've got several actors, primarily from the Cape Cod community, that I will be utilizing once again for A Nightmare with Casey Sherman, including, Christine Mohn, Kevin Lassett, Steve Latimer, Keith Rosary. They're all Cape Cod actors, and they're all incredibly talented. And I always like to work with people that I know can really bring it in front of a live audience. And they're certainly going to be, re-examining the Boston Strangler case on stage, which I reinvestigated. We'll take a look at A Murder in Hollywood, which is about one of the most notorious crimes in Hollywood history. And then the third act will be a recreation of my most recent bestseller, Helltown, which is about a serial murder case in Provincetown in the 1960s. And I'll be walking the audience through my motivations to get involved with a story like that. Some of the, the dark, alleys that I had to really venture into. And then, as I said, bringing these actors on stage to perform dialogue and to showcase some characterizations that I might use for the feature adaptation of Helltown.
Now, we were talking a little bit off camera beforehand, and I found it really interesting. You mentioned, it's great to have immediate feedback when it's a live audience on what lines landed. I mean, in the case of if this was comedy, you could see if the joke laughed, essentially. But in this case, you're trying to maybe scare people.
You're trying to scare people. I also do sprinkle in some comedy because you do need a bit of levity in these theatricals. And plus, true crime is so absurd anyways that there are just naturally some bizarre, if not funny, moments during the show. But you're right, Grady, you get that instant feedback from the audience from something that maybe I'll write it in the script and I think it's going to kill in front of a live audience and it doesn't land. But there's another line of dialogue or something that I'm saying to the audience that really, creates either a gasp or a natural reaction. And I'll use that and then work that into, like I said, the theatrical or I should say the film version of Helltown as we kind of progress this story forward.
Now, as well, obviously, I want to chat a lot about Helltown upcoming. There's been a lot of production side stuff with turning that potentially, you mentioned off camera, but possibly going from a series to a theatrical feature. But before we got there, I wanted to ask a little bit, speaking of finding Whitey, we recently actually had the conviction of his murderer. So I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit how that was for you in terms of a follow-up. Does that kind of provide some level of closure, essentially? What were your thoughts when you heard about that news?
Well, it was interesting because the killer of Whitey Bulger had been in a bit of limbo in solitary confinement since the murder happened. So it's interesting that it had taken this long for Freddie Gius, is his name, to be charged with the crimes and then to be ultimately convicted or, offering up, his guilty plea in this case. And, people always ask me, what was the motivation behind Whitey Bulger's murder? And, myself and my partner in hunting Whitey, Dave Wedge, we're the only journalists who have corresponded with the killer, Freddie Gius. And he used to write us letters with rubber-tipped pencils from solitary confinement. And the reason why they only gave him rubber-tipped pencils is because they were in fear that he would either stick his own jugular or attack a guard. And, we, over the course of our correspondence, understood what his motivation was. It wasn't to silence Whitey and keep him from, giving out any more secrets that he may have had. He'd already spilled his guts many times. So there was really nothing left for him to say. But Whitey Bulger had basically fingered a man for a wrongful conviction, a man, Freddie Weichel, who had served 30 years in prison before ultimately being released. Well, during those 30 years, he was a cellmate and close friend to the killer, Freddie Gius. So this was just eye for an eye, old-fashioned mob vengeance and retribution at the end of the day.
It's very interesting. In your opinion, obviously Whitey Bulger, famous gangster for the local area, is that is with this murder and this conviction, is that the end of an era in terms of America's gangster history, essentially?
Yeah, and I think America's certain fascination with gangsters. I mean, you go from Whitey Bulger to John Gotti, all the way back to Al Capone. There are all obviously many crime bosses out there across the United States, but they stay in the shadows. They don't have these oversized personalities and egos. And I think that, what lent itself to the fascination about Whitey Bulger was, one, he was able to co-opt the FBI for so long, but he was such an incredible, elusive personality. And that just, I think, feeds the fascination of the public. And you just don't see that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, similar to, this is very fantastical of an equation, but like Pirates, very romanticized at some point. And for America, that was the gangster for a while, the 1920s bootleggers and stuff like that. So it definitely seemed like that waned as the violence became more apparent, and even Whitey Bulger himself seemed like he had a interest in his own the ego related there. He'd been reported as going to see, I believe, The Godfather.
It was The Departed, which was a fictionalized version of his story, and the law enforcement officer who spotted him at a theater in San Diego is another Barnstable High School graduate, Richard Eaton. It's amazing how so many people, that I know were involved with that case originally, and he spotted Whitey at The Departed right after The Departed had come out. So, Whitey was always fascinated with how he was being perceived. But when we took Whitey Bulger to the stage at the Wilbur Theater, my job was to deconstruct the myth, was to show him as dark as he really was in real life. And it was, that's my job as a journalist and as a writer, is to take these, very romanticized ideas about criminals and then break them down to the reality. And oftentimes that reality is harsh and disgusting.
Mm-hmm. Casey, I do have, my next question is, what was in the water back then at Barnstable High School, and can I have some? It sounds like you've really been able to you've been able to stretch out, get your tendrils. A lot of people seem to be totally able to help out in assistance with this kind of Hollywood push that you've been doing, of course.
Yeah, there are so many you mentioned Barnstable High School, for example. Neil McDonough, myself. Mm-hmm. There's a director that I went to school with, Steve Kayak, who has a new Rock Hudson documentary that airs on HBO. And we were all, walking the halls of Barnstable High School at the same time. And we had great teachers. Alice Williams, for example, was my English teacher at Barnstable High School and really got me involved with narratives and, understanding Shakespeare as a 15-year-old, who was a movie buff at the time, but really getting back to the written word. And that really, I think, propelled me to kind of where I am today.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I'm not surprised by the movie buff, actually, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But on to the next portion, Helltown. It is the story of Tony Costa murder in Provincetown a few decades back now, back during the hippie era. And so you turned that into a book, and now there's been production put behind it. You've been chatting with some major big league players in the Hollywood sphere. Do you mind just kind of giving us a quick update of where that has been as of late, kind of what the plans are going forward?
So it's interesting. I think the strikes in Hollywood, the talent strike and the writer's strike, kind of brought a lot of these productions back to square one. We had originally had a deal with Amazon to produce a limited series based on Helltown, starring Oscar Isaac as Kurt Vonnegut, who is really the so-called crime reporter that investigated these crimes while he was grappling with his epic book, Slaughterhouse-Five. I had Ed Berger, who is an incredible Oscar-winning director, attached to direct, and Team Robert Downey Jr.'s production company attached to produce. Once the strikes, finalized, we pivoted away from limited series and now are focused on a feature. I always thought of this project or my book as a really kind of a 2.5-hour movie that an audience can see in the theaters, as opposed to a limited series that you may binge on during a weekend. I love that idea of, having a collective audience. Goes back to the theatrical experience where you've got people in the audience who are gasping, who are, frightened. And I think that, really lends itself to the, experience of watching something like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. So as well, I was wondering how the production value might be going in of the ways that you're going to be incorporating that live component to begin with. So do you find yourself like certain characters might get like maybe raised up or shrunk back down, depending? Obviously, 2.5 hours is a bit of a tighter time period. It's probably longer than you're going to have for the stage show, though.
Sure. Oh, yeah, it definitely is. And I think that, again, you get that instant feedback from the audience. So I've got a number of different characters that I'll be bringing to the stage for Helltown during that performance. And I want to see which characters really pop. Which characters do I need to really invest more in as we continue to develop the feature film? Obviously, you're going to have Tony Costa. Obviously, you're going to have Kurt Vonnegut and even Norman Mailer. Tom Gunnery, who was a state police investigator who really, foiled Tony Costa's attempts to stay free. And, he was a Centerville resident for years before I met him. And I'm really kind of investing a lot in him in the stage show because the audience needs somebody to cheer for. They know the killer is there, but who is going to be that, person that is counteracting all of the killer's next moves? And hopefully that'll be, state police detective Tom Gunnery in the film.
Now, as well, so obviously a lot of this plays off of some local authors, Kurt Vonnegut. So it's interesting. You don't really. He's not really like your hero character, quote unquote, because we chatted a bit before about this, and the authors that you have in that are kind of these morally gray forces. Obviously, these are real people, so I don't want to talk about them in a purely fictional sense. But can you talk about kind of like the arts, the writing, the authors, what you're kind of exploring through Kurt Vonnegut, or excuse me, what you kind of discovered, really?
Well, that was really my fascination with the case. There had been another book written about the Tony Costa case back in the 1980s. It's a good procedural book. I didn't want to ever go over somebody's old work, no matter how well it was done. So I looked at, I found out that there were two writers at opposite ends of their own careers, hyper leaning in and hyper focused on this case at the time. You mentioned Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer would later fictionalize the Costa case into a book and film that he titled Tough Guys Don't Dance. And then you have Kurt Vonnegut, who was writing a story for Life magazine. Kurt had claimed that his daughter Edie, who was a student at Barnstable High School at the time, knew Tony Costa and some of the young hippies that were surrounding Tony Costa at the time in 1969. So, Helltown is really about the dark journey that two authors find themselves on as they, continue to get enveloped by this very disturbing serial murder case. And so that was the way that I was able to kind of shift the angle to the story, make it something that I was more interested in writing at the time, because the details of the Costa murders in 1968 and 69 are probably the most horrific that I've ever covered in my 25 years as an investigative journalist. I've covered well over 150 homicides. I've never seen anything this brutal in my entire life. And I've read over every crime scene document. I've looked over every crime scene photo, autopsy photo. And when I was writing the book, I'd go to sleep at night and my wife would wake me up because I was screaming. And she would say, okay, you need to take a week away from this book because it's affecting you. And I told her, I said, well, if it doesn't affect me, then I'm not going to really be able to articulate this story well enough for the readers to go on this journey with me.
A very immersive experience. I mean, I've read the book as well, and I was interested in seeing at what point, you obviously discovered this during the pandemic, but I mean, since then we've had like the Lady of the Dunes, and with Tony Costa, it seems like Cape Cod actually has a lot more of an exciting Outer Cape, shall we say, nightlife than I was aware of before. Were you learning this as well as you were going through?
Well, I mean, growing up here on the Cape, I know that in the winter months, the Cape reverts back to kind of spooky town, and there are all these stories of, Cape Cod lore that you can fall, victim to. Again, you mentioned Lady of the Dunes. I can give you the Crystal Worthington case and so many other fascinating true crime tales that have happened, here on Cape Cod. And it's just racking focus and focusing on them. And I'd heard the Tony Costa story growing up. He was the boogeyman every time I went out on Halloween with my buddies, but I didn't realize how dark and disturbing the crimes were. But again, you mentioned the pandemic. I was driving with my brother Todd Sherman out to Provincetown, and we're down Commercial Street in the height of the summer, and every store was shuttered, and it was eerie to see that. And we started to talk about the ghosts, real and imagined, on the Cape, and we began to talk about Tony Costa. And then I went back to my writing lab, and I started to look at this case, and I thought, okay, there's an incredible story to tell here.
hmm Now, as we're talking about the film component, we're going to come back to what
Sure.
your writing lab looks like at some point. It's fascinating me already. But so Helltown specifically, when you're picturing, I want to talk about the culture of like movies in general and stuff. Immediately, I was taken back to like Zodiac with Jake Gyllenhaal. Great, I'm a big fan of that. So I mean that with only layers of compliments. But is that something the kind of vibe you're going for, like that more like
Oh,
2000s?
absolutely. That, ambiguous crime story that doesn't have that gavel pounding necessary ending. Yes, we do know Tony Costa was the killer of these women, and he is found guilty, during a trial which happened here in Barnstable, one of the most sensational murder trials to me in American history. But the Zodiac is such a great comp. David Fincher. It's dark, it's moody, and I think that the filmmakers that I'm talking to, that I'm working with, have an understanding of that type of vibe and feeling they want to get across. And the killer himself, he was incredibly charismatic, much like Charles Manson. And I learned after I'd already written the book that Charles Manson and Tony Costa actually knew each other, that they were living in the same neighborhood in San Francisco in 1967, going to the same parties. I'm sure they weren't swapping stories about how their killer instincts were evolving at the time, but the fact that they were breathing the same air, and on one side of the United States you have a charismatic hippie messiah killing famous people in Hollywood, and here on the other side of the United States you had his doppelganger in Tony Costa, who was incredibly charismatic, who had a lot of young hippies circling him here in Massachusetts, and that allowed his victims to let their guard down with him, and ultimately that ended up incredibly tragically for them and their families.
hmm Now, while I had you in as well, I wanted to talk a little bit more like grand scheme filmmaking stuff. I've been noticing a bit of an exodus from Hollywood as of late. Of course, Vancouver has always been a haven for filmmaking, but also like Atlanta. And I want to ask you, as a local filmmaker, essentially, what have you been thinking about that? Do you think that the strikes may have kind of split people up a bit more? We've been seeing more filming far afield. Do you think Massachusetts might have some future in the filmmaking industry in general?
I think Massachusetts is probably one of the most aggressive and productive film communities in the entire country. You've got a groundswell of very talented people working on films where, 20 years ago, if you had a major film shot in Massachusetts, the studios would send all of their experts here to Massachusetts to film, whether it's the assistant director, the grip, you name it, the entire crew would be brought to Massachusetts to film. Well, that entire crew now lives here in Massachusetts, and they go from one production to the other. As I said, they're incredibly professional. There's a new Netflix series based on Ellen Hillenbrand's book, The Perfect Couple, which was shot here in Chatham. And I can bet that most of the people that worked on that limited series also worked on my films, The Finest Hours and Patriots Day. It's a small community, but very robust film community here in Massachusetts. And to your earlier point, a lot of people are moving away from LA because of taxes, because of just the topography and the climate. They want to, venture out and work where they live. And New England has been, so convenient for a lot of these very talented professionals to plant their, flag and then work locally and then be able to go back home to dinner, with their wife and kids every night.
I mean, that is certainly an appeal. We have New York as well, with obviously there's like a big Broadway. There's a lot of history of live theater up the Eastern Seaboard in general. Do you think that that's an untapped potential? I'm noticing you're putting your hooks into the live theater space. Is it so you can pull in talent?
It's so you can pull in talent. Exactly. There's nothing that exposes an actor more than being on a stage in front of an audience, or heightens their talent. And I've been able to work with incredibly talented people over the course of my theatrical productions. Some of the actors that I've employed in the past, may not have been able to transition from film to the stage effectively, but then there are others that really, are incredible at that. And those are the people that I always reach out to first for my stage productions. And this production's interesting because everybody is donating their time for A Nightmare with Casey Sherman, March 26th at the Wilbur Theater, because it's also a fundraising event for the Peter Frates Foundation for ALS. I wrote the book on Pete Frates along with my writing partner, Dave Wedge, in 2017. And the mission of ALS families has always been very close to us. So all the proceeds for this particular production are going right to helping people with ALS and helping their families.
Yeah, it's great to hear. It's also it's wonderful to be able to kind of have that nonprofit focus. Quote unquote.
Exactly.
So in general, I also wanted to ask you, you have an upcoming new book that you've been doing. This is Blood in the Water.
Yep.
That is a tremendously local story, and this is all we're talking about off camera. And this is also the first time that you've been covering something that's been so like this is still ongoing. So dare I say, this conversation might have to be quite tempered with.
Sure. Well, the book is done. And I can only tease what we're going to be, the readers are going to be reading in April of next year when the book comes out. But it's actually the second time that I've been working on a story that is enveloping in real time. I wrote, obviously, Patriots Day. So,
Yes.
I was working on that while, along with my partner in that project, Dave Wedge, while, Boylston Street was still smoldering and while, they were actually still looking for the bombers in Watertown. This story is about Nathan Carman. Nathan Carman was a young man on the autism spectrum who in 2016 took his mother out on a deep sea fishing trip off the coast of Rhode Island, and something happened on the boat. The boat sank. The mother disappeared and most likely drowned. And Nathan was a castaway on a life raft for up to 7 days, according to Nathan, before he was rescued by a passing Chinese cargo ship. And when the story broke nationally, it was a bittersweet story because, this young man was saved. Isn't that great? But his mother is likely dead. But when they get Nathan back to the Coast Guard station in Boston, they begin to pick at his story. And they realize that, his life raft shouldn't have been drifting in the direction that it was had he, had the boat gone down where he said it was. So that's kind of the first thing that they looked at. Then they realized that he's also the prime suspect in the shotgun murder of his elderly grandfather 3 years prior, allegedly all to seize control of a $50 million family fortune. Ultimately, Nathan is charged with his mother's murder. He's never charged with his grandfather's murder. And he's about to go to trial last year when he's found dead in his jail cell in New Hampshire. So the trial doesn't happen. I had to really gumshoe this case and interview well over 30 witnesses. And like anybody that has read or watched television episodes about this case, I thought this kid was guilty. Now I can't say that as strongly as I believed it going into this project because other likely suspects in this case emerge throughout my reinvestigation of this case. I think it's probably the best investigative work that I've ever done, and I can't wait for readers to, buy the book April 8th, 2025. It's also available for pre-order right now on Amazon, Blood in the Water.
Yeah, Casey, we'll also have you back in as well when it gets a bit closer to the actual launch date too. And did you interview Coast Guard and stuff like that? Were you able to find people who were there during the rescue?
I've interviewed the Coast Guard. I've interviewed the FBI. I've interviewed a lot of people that knew the family, and a lot of their perspectives are different. I ultimately let the reader decide whether or not this young man was guilty of these two crimes. Some days I wake up and I think he is. I think, the other days I'll wake up and think there's no way he could have pulled it off. And I detail that in the book. And as I said, I think the readers are going to read something much differently than has been out for public consumption since this case exploded nationally in 2016.
All right. Well, we will stay tuned, and also always great to see wonderful journalism. Both sides, never really fully saying one thing or the other. But it's interesting to see, and I look forward to checking it out myself as well when it gets to that April date.
Appreciate it.
So, what is next for you? If this book is just wrapped up, what's the next project? I know you always have something on the back burner. So,
yeah, the next project, I just signed a publishing deal for a book that I'm titling "The Devil and Frank Lloyd Wright," about the most famous architect in American history, if not world history. Frank Lloyd Wright was involved with a mass murder in 1914. that shaped his entire outlook when it came to architecture. So it's an incredible story that really nobody knows about. I'm now in the kind of the hunting and gathering phase of my story. I usually collect all the information ahead of time, and then I can piece together what the narrative is going to look like. That book will be coming out in 2026, but I'm incredibly excited about that.
All right, awesome. What is it? Is it like the cork board with like the red strings going
No, it's not a
across,
murder
or-
board. It's actually all in my head, quite
Really?
frankly. Yes. I see the murder boards on every TV show, and I always get a kick out of that.
Thus the nightmares. Is what I'm beginning to
Yeah.
gather,
No,
Casey.
it's all in my head. I've been doing this for so long, Grady. When I sit down at my keyboard, I can just play. I can just see how this story is going to unfold. Yes, I've got stacks of documentation and letters and personal artifacts that I need to touch, look, and feel before I get to the writing stage. But when I sit down, I kind of know where I'm going. I have a loose idea, I should say, of where I'm going. But the discovery for me and the greatest challenge and the greatest reward is, how am I going to get there? I don't outline my books ahead of time because I feel like it's the journey that I really get excited about.
Real interesting. That's I've heard. I don't remember who told me this, but the idea of like, okay, when you sit down, you're moving your fingers at the keyboard. That's typing. But what's happening? I'm pointing at my head for those who aren't watching the video. That's the writing.
That's the writing, and I'm writing when I'm not typing. I write 24/7. I'm always, involved in a story that I'm working on or looking ahead at. Yes, I'm still in the present, but I do, I do spend a lot of time thinking about these stories that just, speak to me.
All right. Well, just for the creatives out there and those who are interested in the arts themselves, do you mind just telling us what your setup looks like? Are you cranking out the old typewriter, or are you more of a computer guy? What's your home studio look like?
Yeah, I wrote my first 2 books on a computer, on a typewriter rather, using the whiteout, and that became such a process that I do have a laptop. I surround myself with great music. I surround myself with, obviously, the documentation I need to be able to have at my ready anytime I'm looking to kind of write the next chapter or the next part of that story. I surround myself with literature when I'm writing. I like to read. That is really, that's flexing and exercising my mental muscles. I'll go to bed with 2 books every night and read, probably 10 pages from each book just to keep the muscles working. And I always learn from other writers that, go take me on their journey. I said, oh, geez, that's really interesting. They were able to articulate this period of time in a certain way. I won't copy that, but it certainly will influence how I might approach a certainly challenging part of the story that I'm working on.
Well, at risk of starting the next Cape Cod Broadcasting Book Club, can I ask, what is Casey Sherman reading as of late? Do you have some favorite books that's been on your nightstand? Or
Sure.
Some stuff, or?
I just finished a book called There Will Be Blood, and I think it's an excellent, excellent story about the assassination attempt against Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, perpetrated by the IRA. And it focuses on both sides, the militant IRA side of that story, and also the bombing detectives at Scotland Yard that were really trying to hunt these people down before they could do even more damage. It's written by an Irish writer, but it's a very balanced story, and it's fantastic.
All right, awesome. We'll have to check that out at some point. Casey, I'm afraid that's about coming up on time at this point, but is there anything else you wanted to highlight for our listeners while I still have you about ongoing projects, stuff you're excited about, anything you wanted to hit for
Sure. I'm also, working diligently to bring the Pete Frates story to the big screen. It's the 10th year anniversary of the Ice Bucket Challenge, which created a social media phenomenon across the world. Now, think about this, Grady. Before the Ice Bucket Challenge, there was no GoFundMe. There weren't buttons on social media apps that lent themselves to fundraising. Pete Frates created that environment, which is now culminated in billions of dollars generated for charities around the world. And at the heart of his story is a love story between he and his wife, Julie Frates, that I'm really capturing. Myself, Dave Wedge, and our screenwriting partner, Jake Crane, We're working on the script based on Pete's life. It's also a love story about baseball because Pete was a baseball player, and about Fenway Park. I actually had an event at Fenway Park back in August to recognize the 10th anniversary of the Ice Bucket Challenge with Pete Frady's family, with Governor Healy, with members of the Red Sox and other celebrities that, and members of the medical community that could talk about the advancements that have been made over 10 years. So that, I would say, is my passion project to get that film made. And every day I wake up trying to advance that project for sure.
All right, awesome. A very sweet story as well. 10 years, actually. Wow, time flies.
Yes,
It
exactly.
just feels like yesterday I was doing that in school, essentially.
Right.
But now it's, 10 years. Well, it's great to hear there's been a lot of progress, though. And good luck getting that to the stage and to the getting it onto the silver screen, potentially.
I'm excited about it.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Casey, for joining me for this conversation. It has been a pleasure, as always.
Always a pleasure for me, Grady. Thank you so much.
I'm Grady Culhane, and thank you for listening. I'm Grady Culhane in the CapeCod.com News Center.